Friends of the media, thank you for coming to the press conference today. Because of the epidemic, we have made certain arrangements today. We have limited the number of reporters present, and also we ask you to sit further apart. So thank you for your cooperation. And for photographers, I know you need to move around because of your work, so we have kept clear the first row here for you. But while you work, please try to maintain social distance as far as possible. Now I will first invite the Chief Executive to speak. Friends of the media, members of the public, the epidemic has now become a global pandemic. As for the number of confirmed cases, this morning is exceeded 590,000 cases. There's also been a spike in the number of deaths. And we've seen that in many countries, the healthcare system has been seriously overloaded. The situation is dire. As for Hong Kong, today, we have a record high of 65 new confirmed cases. So the total number of confirmed cases now as high as 518. In a short space of 2 weeks, the number of confirmed cases has increased from 138 to 518 in Hong Kong. That's an increase of twofold. So we could see how serious the situation is. And then for this week, for the new cases, some 90% are imported cases. They are Hong Kong residents returning to Hong Kong from overseas. There are also Hong Kong residents who had travel history during their incubation period, or they are close contacts of these two clusters. As for some of the new confirmed cases, they involved, drinking at bars, attending wedding banquets and private parties. So this is what we call social contact. Now, in the face of the rapid developments in the epidemic, the SL government has always been taking swift actions. On the 23rd of March, Monday, I announced 4 aspects of measures. First of all, we would limit non-Hong Kong residents coming into Hong Kong from overseas. We've tried to minimize the risk of imported cases. In a moment, the Secretary for Security, Mr. Johnny, will tell you about how effective this measure has been. But at the same time, we have to bear in mind there is still a large number of Hong Kong residents who will have to come back here. The second aspect of measure is about enhancing testing for people arriving in Hong Kong, also for people in the community, so that we could achieve early detection, early isolation and treatment. In a moment, I will invite Professor Sophia Chan to tell you about these measures. The third aspect of our work is to take law enforcement action against those subject to quarantine orders. We've also taken strong measures to crack down on those breaching the orders. Here, I would like to thank the people of Hong Kong. They've been supporting our work and reporting cases of breach of the quarantine orders to us. In a moment, Mr. Johnny again will give you more details. The fourth aspect of work is about minimizing social contact. On Monday, I announced that for all private clubs under the private recreational lease to close their sports facilities, children's play facilities, changing rooms, and so on. We are happy to note that for all 60-plus such private clubs, they have suspended those facilities. As for other private clubs not affected, not under the private recreational leases or recreational facilities at universities, they've also adopted the same measure. And also, I proposed, it was just a proposal on Monday, that we would amend the legislation to ban the sales and supply of alcohol at bars, restaurants, and private clubs temporarily. After the announcement of this proposal, there's been much discussion in the community. But I think that's a good thing, and that's exactly what we need in the community here. Because we want to further reduce social contact, we need to fight the epidemic together. So what is the biggest challenge we face? I think after discussion, we've arrived at a consensus. The challenge we face is that we need to reduce contact between people. We need to reduce gatherings, meal gatherings, and so on. So during this period, I've met with the catering sector twice to listen to their views. The community believes that if we just ban the sales or supply of alcohol, it is not a targeted approach. we all appreciate what we need to deal with is the gathering of people, people having meals together and meeting each other. Now, we have a public health emergency at hand, so we need stronger measures, including enacting legislation to ban and prevent gatherings of large scales. It doesn't matter what occasions are and what industries are involved with respect to these gatherings. So the Executive Council called a special meeting this afternoon. We endorsed 2 new pieces of regulation under CAP 1599, the Prevention and Control of Disease Ordinance. One of the regulations is to ban a gathering of more than 4 people in public places. That is, prohibit group gatherings in public place. Anyone or any gathering that has more than 4 persons would be caught under this regulation, would be regarded as a group gathering, and it would be banned. The other regulation is about regulating catering service and the operation of certain premises. I will be giving you an explanation later. Now, these regulations are temporary measures in response to the public health emergency. The Secretary for Food and Health will give directives for a certain period, and during the period, these regulations will be valid. And each time a directive issue, it will not be for more than 14 days. But of course, after 14 days, if there is still a need to carry on with the measure, then another directive will be issued that will be valid for another 14 days. Now, I'm going to give you the details of the 2 regulations. First, the regulation is to ban group gathering. So, put simply, if there is a gathering of more than 4 persons, then such gatherings are banned. They are illegal. But of course, you could imagine in our day-to-day activities, we do have gatherings of more than 4 people often. So that's why there is a series of exemptions under the regulation for different types of group gatherings. There are about 12 types. I will give you the details later. Now, about cases where more than 4 people together would involve gathering at the workplace or for the purpose of performing a government function. For example, like today, there are more than 4 of us here, because here we are here to perform a government function. And also that covers the court proceedings, legislative council proceedings, district council proceedings. That is for these, for the legislature and other bodies, they could continue with the meetings. And weddings and funerals and will also be covered under exemption. By wedding here, I mean the ceremony itself and not banquet. Banquet will be covered under the other regulation on the catering service. So the regulation will come into effect at 00 hours on the 29th of March, Sunday. And as I mentioned, the validity period is for 14 days. Then the other regulation covers 2 parts. One part is on the catering in services, that is all licensed restaurants, eateries, coffee shops, bars, and so on. They need to comply with 6 requirements. Firstly, the number of seats should not be more than 50% of the normal seating capacity in the premises. That means the premises can only be half full at most. And then there should be a distance of 1.5 meters at least between tables, or there should be other form of segregation. And then for each table, there cannot be more than 4 persons. That's the 3rd point. 4th point, both customers and staff must wear masks. And of course, when customers are eating or drinking, they can take off their mask. But after they finish eating, when they're just chatting, then they must put on the mask again. And the 5th requirement is that everyone must go through a temperature check as they enter the premises. And 6thly, the premises must provide a sanitizing hand rub for all people going to the premises. And the second part of the regulation is about closure of 6 types of premises. So after the regulation takes effect, these premises will have to close. First, game center or amusement game centers in full. So there is a legal definition for amusement game center. Second type is a bathhouse. The third type is a fitness center. The fourth type, place of amusement. And that includes billiard rooms, bowling alleys, skating rinks. And the fifth type is place of public entertainment. Here it includes cinemas. The sixth type, places for for hire for hosting parties, party rooms in general. So this regulation will take this part of the regulation will take part earlier. That is at 6 p.m. tomorrow on the 28th of March. Again, the validity period is for 14 days. In the two regulations, there will be provisions on the law enforcement, inspections, enforcement powers, and so on. There are also penalties, involving fines and imprisonment. We will be giving all the details in a press release later on. And finally, I would like to say that on our regulation of these various trades, of course, these trades will be affected. It's going to add insult to injury to them. And then the employees will be affected too. The SAO government fully appreciates that, but then we are talking about public health and we are fighting an epidemic here, so we have to take this step at this point in time. But then I can promise that the SAO government will be giving financial assistance. The general direction is that during this period, we are asking employers not to dismiss their staff during this period. If they dismiss their staff now, then in future, if they apply for financial subsidies, their eligibility may be affected. And for such financial assistance is primarily designed to protect staff and employees. Now, in the middle of February, I announced the setting of the anti-epidemic fund. There are 24 items under the fund. And in the past months or so, I see that the various trades and industry are being hit more. There are already certain trades which could benefit from the anti-epidemic fund, like the tourism sector. And of course, we know all around the world there is at least a red travel alert, so there won't be many visitors coming to Hong Kong. And that's why the tourism sector is further hit. Now, the sector has already benefited once under the anti-epidemic fund, but they are still struggling. And then there are other sectors not yet covered by the fund. Since we launched the fund, we've received reminders from many sectors that they've been left out. So I announced that the SAO government is going to launch a second round of anti-epidemic fund. We will deal with the two sectors I mentioned that face huge difficulties. Now, these sectors, whether they've been affected by our measures to enhance social distancing, well, we will deal with all of them. In the coming week, I will invite the relevant Bureau directors to liaise with the trade to work out suitable measures, and then we'll have to go to the Finance Committee to ask for funding. Now, I'll invite Professor Sylvia Chen to tell you more about the testing of the disease.
Thank you, Chief Executive, and good evening, friends of the media. To protect the public health and our healthcare system, the government infection control work highlights the Chief Executive had already elaborated 4 major measures, and these 4 measures, and especially on how to we prevent imported cases proliferating in the community, I would like to give you some new information. Of course, early identification of asymptomatic cases is a key part of our infection control, especially at this stage. And all along, for those showing fever and those respiratory symptoms, or in the 14 days prior to onset with travel history, we will perform testing on them. In view of those of the imported cases and those travel history record a sharp spike. So the Center for the Health Protection, and since the 19th of March, has already stepped up the enhanced laboratory surveillance to provide all arrivals but asymptomatic travelers on testing for the COVID-19 virus, and enlarge the scope of testing for early identification of infected persons and reduce the risk of local transmission. And since the 25th of March, and for the UK and US and the other European returnees, we have offered testing service for them on a targeted basis. And yesterday, on 26th of March, and the Asia World Expo, we set up a temporary specimen taking center to accelerate sample collection. And it was always to facilitate those persons who had difficulty to send their friends and family members to send the specimen jar to container points. And from the period into 26th of March, at the Hong Kong airport, we have distributed 5,613 container jars to arrivals and received and finished testing 2,804 samples. And 26 of these samples have tested positive, made up 0.19% of all specimens, 0.9% of all tested samples, and for this illustrated that this viral testing is very important for early identification of cases, so that could able to get treatment early and would not lead to a community transmission. Here are the enhanced measures. First, we're proactively prepared to further enlarge the scope of the surveillance. And currently in the airport, and over the past 2 days that has just started, we will cover all asymptomatic arrivals. For these group of persons, will be given a specimen container at the airport. And like I said, at the Asia World Expo, we have set up a temporary testing center. Well, they have 2 ways to submit their containers. First, they could take the shuttle bus to the temporary specimen collection center and follow the instructions to collect the deep throat saliva samples. Upon completion, they can submit the specimen to the Department of Health staff and return to the residence as soon as possible to undergo the 14 days home quarantine. Or 2, they can collect their samples at home and through friends or families to return the container on the same morning to a designated collection point. And the second enhancement measures that we'll be looking into providing greater convenience for those arrivals submitting their samples. And earlier on, we have expanded collection points from 13 to 31 locations. And now we've been actively looking into other ways to collect the samples. And for example, on let's say collection, this is ongoing. And third, to collect more samples for early identification of patients. And while perfecting our collection mechanism, we will also studying or mandating all the arrivals to return their samples within a specified time. In fact, the early identification of cases not only help the patients to receive early treatment, but also minimize the risk of their families and the close contacts of catching the virus. As for the arrangements, if the test results come back positive, the CHP will contact these persons as soon as possible and arrange them to receive treatment at public hospitals. Generally speaking, and within 3 working days have yet to heard back from the Department of Health. That means that their samples are tested negative, and the persons will need to continue to complete their home quarantine until the end of 14 days. I would like to make a special appeal that all arrivals should proactively cooperate with the government specimen collection measures and to allow the Department of Health and CHP public health laboratories to perform virus testing on them as soon as possible and identify asymptomatic patients to reduce the risk of community transmission. And on hospital authority, And since the 20th of March, I would like to talk about the situation in Asia World Expo. Well, we'll see the expected, and for some time in future, we'll deal with a large group of arrivals as well as to referrals for the Port Health Division to public hospital on suspected infected cases, and the HA have received the instruction of the epidemic committee since the 20th of March, and on Asia World Expo in North Lantau, we set up the testing centers. And those showing respiratory symptoms, we'll talk about those with symptoms that upon arrival that we will perform testing on them. Looking at the figures, from 20th of March till yesterday, 26th of March at 9 o'clock evening, there are 103 arrivals transferred to Asian World Expo and North Lantau Hospital testing centers for testing on the COVID-19 virus. As of now, there are 498 test results as negative and had already returned to their residence to continue with their 14 days home quarantine. And those tested preliminary positive, the Department of Health will conduct further testing, and upon confirmation that we will announce them in due course. And finally, I would like to make another appeal. In order to protect the Hong Kong public and our healthcare system, I appeal to everyone that for those who are subject to the quarantine orders, they must exercise self-discipline, and we actually express the gratitude to a huge majority of those who exercise self-discipline. And second, I hope that these arrivals will proactively cooperate with the government on the specimen collection measures. And thirdly, just now the Chief Executive has said that is very important, and hope that the public can exercise self-restraint and be patient and adopt all the social distancing measures and to minimize going out. So long we can work together and we not let off our guard, and we can fight this epidemic together.
Next, can I invite the Secretary for Security to speak? Thank you, Chief Executive. In March, the government implemented a series of measures to reduce the risk of imported cases. On the 19th of March, all arrivals from other countries must be subject to 14 days of mandatory quarantine. And then on the 25th of March, we started to measure that for people arriving at the Hong Kong International Airport by flight from other countries, and the people who have been to other overseas countries within the past 14 days, they have been denied entry to Hong Kong. And we've also suspended the transit service at the airport. Now we have implemented this series of measures. So there's a significant drop in the number of arrivals, especially for non-Hong Kong resident visitors. On the 25th of March, that is the day one of the implementation of all these measures, non-Hong Kong resident visitor arrival at the airport dropped by 82%. Before the implementation of the measures, that is 928 people on the 24th of March, it dropped to 164 people. And then yesterday, the 26th of March, there's a further drop to 132 persons. That means there's a drop of 86% compared to the pre-measure days. As for the Hong Kong-Macau Bridge boundary control point, for the number of non-Hong Kong residents arriving in Hong Kong, again, that's a drop of 97% since the implementation of the measure. Before the measure, there were 989 people that dropped to 26 people. Yesterday, there were 31 people. For the Shenzhen Bay boundary crossing point, for the number of non-Hong Kong resident arrivals, it was 329 before the implementation measure, and it's dropped to there's a drop of about 60%. And it was 138 on the 26th, and then yesterday was 124 arrivals. So for all the three control points, the total number of arrivals involving non-Hong Kong residents before the implementation of the measures, that is on the 24th of March, there were a total of 2,246 arrivals, and after the implementation measures dropped to 328 arrivals. That means a drop of 85%. Yesterday, the arrival number was 287. That's a drop of 87%. For the number of Hong Kong residents returning, before the implementation of the measures, there were 12,537. And then on the 25th, there were 4,969 arrivals, so a drop of about 60%. Yesterday, the number of arrivals was 4,117, a drop of 66%. So for the total number of arrivals, including both Hong Kong and non-Hong Kong residents, before the implementation of measures, it was 14,783. On the first day of the measure, it dropped to 3,297. Yesterday, it was 4,458. So on the whole, over 90% of the arrivals are Hong Kong residents. Next, on tracing people in breach of the quarantine orders, I'll give you some figures. Since the implementation of the new measures, that is starting from the 19th of March to the 26th of March, those in breach of the quarantine orders, the police found tracked down 77 of them. Of this 77, 40 were reported by the public, including passers-by or security guards of their residence, hotels. In some cases, it was the family members who reported these individuals. For these 77 people, they were sent to our quarantine centers. The police will be collecting evidence, and then they will pass this evidence to the Department of Health to consider whether to take up prosecution. The advice of the Department of Justice will be sought. Now, these people who breach the quarantine orders are most irresponsible. They will put others at risk. It is not right for them to do that. So we are grateful to the members of the public for reporting these individuals. Now, for people who breach the quarantine orders, as I said, the first thing we do is to send them to quarantine centers. And then secondly, after investigation, we will refer the cases to the Department of Health to consider prosecution. Because we want to keep up the achievements we have made in fighting the pandemic. We don't want such irresponsible individuals to derail our effort in fighting the epidemic. Thank you. Questions now? Please raise your hands. Please first identify yourself and then speak into the microphone, please. On the left over there, the one with spectacles. I'm from Hong Kong 01, Chief Executive. I have 3 questions. First one, on Monday, you announced the alcohol ban. Just now you explained it was just a proposal. But as soon as you announced the ban, a number of Executive Council members came out to say that they didn't agree, and then the experts also said that they never talked to you about the alcohol ban. Now today you say you're not going to do it. Does it mean that the announcement was not thought through, and now you have to go back on your own measure? And then today you're announcing a proposal to ban the gathering of more than 4 people, but that it will involve much enforcement effort. Have you considered it? What about foreign domestic helpers gathering on Sunday? And then there are people going hiking on the weekends, and will you have people patrolling these places? Who will be responsible for law enforcement? Would it be the police? And if people breach the regulation, would they be fined or imprisoned? And then third question is also about limiting the size of gathering. You say weddings and funerals will be exempted, and also gatherings at workplaces will be exempted. What about people on public transport? There are many people gathering on public transport. And what are you going to do? How do you deal with that? Thank you.
星期一
There are 3 questions. Well, this Monday, like I said, working in 4 areas on the 4th aspect on how do we minimize socializing. We floated a few proposals which we acted right away. For example, on the same night, we have written those private clubs on private recreation leases and asked them to close. The impact is immediately. The next 2 or 3 days, all of them have closed such facilities. As I heard there are views, well, this may not be the expert opinion because there are divergent views in the community. We're seeing that the few bars in Lai Kwai Fong that have this a cluster infection and see it as a high-risk area. The government should take some action to minimize the cross-infection in these places. So on that day, I clearly state this is a proposal, that for it to be implemented, we require legislation. So, and the following week, we shall look into the proposal. This is just a proposal. Like I said, when we floated this proposal, the public response has been strong and with very heated debate, which I see as a positive thing, allow the public to focus on our effort on social distancing or even minimizing socializing activities. And as a whole, the public has a consensus that regardless of the kind of premises, whether it be a bar, a restaurant, or like fitness centers and so forth, they may have led to the gathering of crowds and not be dealt with together. On the other hand, we should not target a particular sector, not just as F&B. For example, some entertainment venues may lead to crowd gatherings. And even in a public open space, for example, in parks or even on footbridges, there also can be crowd gatherings. So we ask the government to deal with this. And after collecting your opinions, we have announced that we will enact 2 new regulations to deal with this. On dealing with this epidemic, we have been very willing to listen. Thus, the EXCO member, well, we announced this on Monday, and we have not been discussed in the EXCO. And hope that the public can begin the debate early. So if the EXCO members would like to speak on this issue, well, as 2 or 3 years in the Chief Executive, I very much welcome the EXCO members to speak out. And one of the experts claimed that this has been not discussed in the expert advisory team. This is true. In fact, their message and the advice to us is that we must enhance social distancing. And very often, we would not let down the expert to come to talk to detail on every measure. These are my advisors. Because to implement this expert opinion into a policy, that's the role of the government. And also, a government have their own considerations. That during this period, we have to adopt the most appropriate measures to resolve the problem at hand. Second, on the enforcement and the penalties for the 2 new regulations, I'll defer to the secretaries or the permanent secretary to discuss this. And thirdly, and pardon me, you have yet to give it a copy of the regulations, which offer 12 exemptions. Well, frankly, that we are racing against the clock. So our law draftsman is still doing their work, and because of this, this new regulation on group gathering in public place may need to release a few hours later. That will maybe before the F&B establishment-related regulations. One of the exemption is about public transport. For example, when they take in public transport, of course, there will be more than 4 people. We can't expect as a bus can only sit 4 people. Such will also be exempted. As for your question, as for the extreme, you will offer no exemption. That means Hong Kong will come to a standstill. That we can no longer attend press briefings to report for the public or ask questions. Thus, we have to strike a balance here. that under what situation that where they allow the group gathering of more than 4 people and exempt it and would not make this unlawful. Otherwise, that would give rise to more problems. I'll let Secretary Chen talk about enforcement and penalties. As for the catering establishment regulations, for if anyone without a reasonable defense and violates regulations will be convicted, there will be fined $50,000 or 6 months imprisonment. So that's a level 5 fine. And for the group gathering regulations, we'll have fixed penalty of $2,000 or 25,000 penalty and 6 months imprisonment. So that was on the group gathering and public place regulations. For the enforcement, I'll pass over to the Director of Food and Hygiene. Well, once this regulation takes effect, the enforcement personnel will conduct patrols and to get to the situation. And when we first enacted legislation, some of the catering outlets may not be fully aware of this. And for the enforcement, I'll pass over to Ms. Vivian Lau, Director of Food and Environmental Hygiene. As for the regulations applicable to the catering outlets, we know that most of the food premises were issued license by the FEHT, and the bars were also given a liquor license, and also for clubs and societies. And for the FEHT enforcement, we conduct routine patrols on a risk-based principles. And with the regulations and directives from the Secretary, that the FEHT will make them internal deployment to step up the patrolling. And on the directives, there are 6 rules for them to abide to. And usually we require on-site visits to determine any potential contraventions. And if so, that we will conduct law enforcement in accordance with the provisions. As for other law enforcement agencies, they will adopt a similar approach to FEHT to deal with the enforcement matters. I would like to make a supplement. Now we are facing a public health emergency. Therefore, while ensuring there's sufficient to commence this measure when there are full deployment, I hope that these tough measures will set up as a deterrent. I hope that all members of the public will be self-restrained for themselves and for the community to let Hong Kong to win this battle against the epidemic, so that we not resort to enforcement. First, they need to exercise self-restraint and be patient. And unless necessary, they should avoid going out. If they have to go out, they should avoid crowd gathering activities.
Next, please. On the right there, the front row. I'm from TVB. 3 questions. First, it's already the end of the month. Next week, at the end of the month, there are usually public events, and there may be demonstrations and processions too. So you ban gatherings of more than 4 people. Are you banning all such events as well? And which department will be responsible for enforcement? Second question is on implementation. Now, let's say there are 9 people split into 3 tables, so 3 persons per table, or maybe there are families of 5 parents with 3 children. Does it mean that they can't eat in a restaurant? So would there be difficulties in enforcement, in execution? And then now you going back on the alcohol ban, have you succumbed to public pressure, or is it because you did not first seek views on the industry, you actually neglected them before? The question about public events and how and this regulation, I'll leave that to the Secretary for Security. And now on the alcohol ban, actually I already said so. Now, I found that during this period, whether our measures will be effective or not would very much depend on public support. For example, the public supported the imposition of the 14-day mandatory home quarantine for arrivals from overseas. So then when the public see people blatantly breaching the quarantine order, and these are people wearing the wristbands, and so the public are unhappy, and then they come forward to report them. So now that's why it's important that we have public support on any harsh measures taken by the government. That's why on Monday I already said that it was just a proposal, and then the next few days we have to discuss the legislative exercise and before we could put it in place. And after that, I met with two groups to listen to their views. And also, there was much views expressed through media reports. And the view was that we should focus on regulating gatherings and instead of just targeting a particular trade or scenario. So the government has listened to these views. Now, it doesn't matter how you describe my act to listen to views. It doesn't matter to me. What is important that we have wide public support in rolling out these relatively harsh measures, because the next 2 weeks will be critical and we need to be able to contain the epidemic. And then second point about the catering industry. Well, the catering industry is subject to the food business regulation. And for these 6 requirements, one of the requirements that on each table there can be just 4 persons, and and between tables there must be at least 1.5 meters apart. If there are 9 persons going to dinner and they sit on 3 different tables and those 3 tables are set apart as required, then it's fine to me. And if there are 5 people going to dinner, yes, they are affected by this requirement. Maybe they will need to have 3 sitting on one table and another 2 sitting on another table. So it depends on how people follow this regulation, and then we will be able to minimize social distancing and minimize the chance of cross-infection. Secretary for Security, please, on enforcement and public events. Now, the kind of public gatherings we try to control here are totally separate from the public processions and demonstrations we've been talking about. Now, for public processions and demonstrations, if they are carried out peacefully and lawfully, that's fine. And here, with this control of gatherings, is purely because of public health consideration, and it's only a temporary measure for 14 days. It's because we want people to maintain social distance and reduce contact. So you shouldn't really confuse the 2 issues. Here on the front, please.
It's from South China Morning Post. So after the U-turn of your alcohol ban, so what confidence should the community have that your government would not change its stance on these other measures you just announced tomorrow? You said you just raised a suggestion on Monday, but your wordings on Monday was more like an announcement. So has something gone wrong in the decision-making process? The second question on the timetable of announcing such series of measures, don't you think the government has been slow and indecisive in taking these drastic measures to contain the surge? And final questions on the estimates of residents returning from overseas. As overseas epidemic situation has further worsened, what are the contingency plans? And right now, the arrivals from the mainland do not need to wear wristbands. And what's your response on calls from experts that tougher measures should be put on them? Thank you.
Well, there are 3 questions. One is whenever a government policy requires legislative backup, that piece of legislation has to be enacted with the approval of the Legislative Council upon the endorsement of the Executive Council. So it is not entirely correct to say that there has been a decision-making in enacting a piece of legislation to ban the consumption and supply of alcoholic drinks in bars or restaurants. That particular proposal has not reached that stage. That proposal was floated by me, of course, having discussed internally within the government as a means to enhance social distancing as a result of the large number of confirmed cases arising from customers gathering in bars, particularly in a location in Hong Kong. So I'm very pleased that upon our suggestion, there has been very extensive discussions and active debate in society on whether that particular measure was an effective one. The consensus is perhaps any measure to tackle the issue of infection should not be focused on a particular sector, a particular setting. But the crux of the matter is to reduce social interactions as far as possible. So today, we are announcing, with the endorsement of the Executive Council, a piece of subsidiary legislation in order to achieve that objective. So any gatherings of 4 persons or more will be prohibited unless it has been specifically exempted under that piece of regulation. Now, as far as your second question, I think the best way to look at the effectiveness of the Hong Kong SAR government's various measures over the past 2 and 3 months is to look at the incidence of infection in Hong Kong as well as the absolute cases. Yes, we are very worried by the surge in cases in Hong Kong, especially a record-breaking 65 cases today. But if you look at the comparison, Hong Kong ranks very low when compared to other countries in terms of both the absolute numbers and also the incidence of infection per 1 million population. I wouldn't say that this is entirely the credit or the results of government intervention. That is also the collective efforts of the people of Hong Kong. But certainly what we have done at various stages, almost on a weekly basis and a daily basis, we have been making announcements, introducing measures, enacting at least 4 pieces of new regulations. All these efforts point to the direction of trying to contain the spread of this virus. As far as the third question about returnees from overseas, the first question we need to answer is, do we allow them to come back? The answer has to be yes, because these are Hong Kong residents. They enjoy the right to enter and exit Hong Kong under the Basic Law, which is a constitutional as well as a human rights for the people of Hong Kong. So we have to enable them to come in. Allowing them to come in, but at the same time trying to contain the virus is a major challenge, because all these Hong Kong people returning apparently are from highly infectious places. If you look at the numbers, I think Hong Kong students studying in the United Kingdom have already clocked up over 30 cases of confirmed cases. So the response is really to ask for their cooperation, to subject themselves to the compulsory 14-day quarantine at home, to respect the monitoring measures that we have put in place, like the wristbands and this location sharing service, and also to participate in the test that we have introduced. And we will enhance the test as Secretary Sophia Chan has outlined to you. Now, as far as mainland arrivals, there are now very, very few mainland arrivals after all these measures have been put in place. I suppose you are referring to the second batch of returnees of Hong Kong people from Hubei. Is that right? From Hubei. There isn't many daily. Secretary Lee could give you the figures about mainlanders coming in. As far as the Hubei returnees, according to the experts, their risk is much lower than the returnees from highly infectious places overseas. And we have to be very pragmatic and realistic. All the things that we are now using in this anti-epidemic work are in short supply. Hospital beds, especially isolation beds, are in short supply. Quarantine centers are in short supply. Quarantine camps are in short supply. Medication, perhaps sooner or later, will be in short supply. Wristbands are in short supply. Staff are in short supply. So we have to be very realistic and find a way forward in order to make the full use of our short supply of resources in order to achieve the objective on a sustainable basis. Because I don't know how long this will last, especially we still have quite a large number of Hong Kong people coming back by air. So the earlier arrangement is for the Hubei returnees. Since they are of lower risk, they could be put on another form of monitoring, which is the apps for location sharing, which is far more convenient for returnees from mainland, because I think many of them will have this WeChat service. But as far as other monitoring things, other monitoring measures, they are the same. We are as vigilant as we could in ensuring that people coming back to Hong Kong will not cause more spread of the virus in Hong Kong. Thank you.
邊度翻嚟嘅香港人？邊度翻嚟嘅？
Don't know. There are so many people abroad. You can only estimate on the basis of flights, how many flights there are every day coming back from overseas. Yeah.
The gentleman at the far left, please.
Thank you. Good evening, Mrs. Lam, Hong Kong Free Press. Why is the government not enacting a full curfew and closing restaurants like other countries? Is the government putting business first? Second, Beijing is claiming each day that they have no new domestic cases. As some people return to Hong Kong from China and with borders set in the future to be relaxed, do you have 100% trust in the accuracy of Beijing's epidemic data? And this one isn't about the virus, but it's quite urgent. We know of US journalists set to be ousted this week from China who also have a Hong Kong permanent residency. How can they be barred from journalism here? The Immigration Department has nothing to do with their cases. Will Hong Kong defy Beijing on this, or somehow tell a permanent resident that they can't work a certain job?
Well, there are a few questions. I try to answer them, and perhaps Secretary for Security could supplement if needed. Well, first is in the course of rolling out anti-epidemic measures, we are guided by the advice from the experts in the expert advisory panels. The most important advice given to me over the last few days is really on enhancing social distancing. But we were also very aware that Hong Kong needs to continue, because there are a lot of normal operations, activities that need to continue, just like we need still goods trucks coming into Hong Kong, bringing Hong Kong the food and daily necessities that we need. So it's not a question of putting which sector's interest above which sector's interest. We are acting in the overall public interest of Hong Kong. Well, as far as the situation in mainland, I think everybody is fully aware that the situation has stabilized. If not because of the imported cases, there would be no more cases in the mainland. That's why the mainland authorities, like Hong Kong authorities, are now very worried of importation of cases from abroad. And you might have picked up already from today, Guangdong has also imposed certain quarantine arrangements on arrivals from Hong Kong and Macau into Guangdong. Whether the mainland situation or statistics could be trusted, I will refer you to what the WHO has said about the situation. As far as the immigration matters, we will act in accordance with the law. As I've mentioned, we cannot deny the entry of Hong Kong residents despite they coming back from highly infectious places. It's exactly because of the law, the constitutional and human rights of these people. So in all individual cases about foreigners coming in and other things, we will act in strict accordance with the law.
答多最後兩條。
Last two questions.
4 questions. No, I've answered that.
Journalism, permanent residents
Sorry,
who may be barred from journalism in Hong Kong.
So I think the
We
CE
will
has.
be acted in accordance with the law.
請右手邊嗰位記者。
China CCTV. President Xi at the G20 summit had mentioned that the COVID-19 have the raging around the world, and the public will need confidence and solidarity to combat the virus together and to put our acts together. And how do you see the President Xi's statement on 4 focuses, highlights, and Hong Kong in fighting this epidemic? And how do you strengthen cooperation with the mainland? And second, President Xi also mentioned that the global community would need to isolate the virus but not each other. While the country is pushing the anti-epidemic work have been cut to foster global cooperation, and I wonder if you can talk a bit more about this. First, since the 21st of March, the WHO had declared that entered the global pandemic, and we now exactly need all the countries to work together. Are you afraid there are not any countries not affected by this virus? As we enter the age of globalization economy, that no one can be left alone. For the President Xi's statement is response to the world landscape, which most require our focus. There are common enemies, only one, this virus. So that we work together to fight this virus. And President Xi's on the international communication, and he was speaking on the level of global cooperation. However, that's very inspiring for Hong Kong. Like I said, to fight this epidemic, we need to stay together and put our minds together. And even for this 7 million strong city, we need a cooperation, not confrontation. We need an understanding, but not a hand-wringing. We need a confidence, but not frustration. I wear this turquoise color dress that because Hong Kong will win this battle, and very soon there will be blue skies ahead. Last question. RTHK. On the restriction on crowd gatherings, the capping at 4. How do you come up with this 4? And you can see some children's play group that are still operating. Will they fall under the workplace exemption allowed to operate? And would it lead to the risk of transmission? And second, a question for Secretary for Security on the sedition laws. The chairman of the Central and Western District Council and Chan Lai-king arrested for sedition. This shows that even before we implement Article 23, the Hong Kong is capable of enforcement, of applying the sedition laws and make it a risk for a doxing police officer. And what's your take on this? And finally, there was a female police officer confirmed with the COVID-19 virus, and while drawing blood, she refused to wear a mask at the hospital. What's the government opinion of this rule? Request the police or even the government to maintain the vigilance on the epidemic? On the first question, I'll take the first question.
First, on controlling gatherings. Well, to tell the truth, there is, nothing too scientifically based. We've looked at the practices in other countries. The size, the limit could be between 10 and 2. And in Hong Kong, we believe 4 is appropriate because just now there was a question that what if a family of 4, aren't you not going to allow them to eat? But of course, if it's 10 persons at a table, we're really worried about cross-infection because, places are rather crowded in Hong Kong. And so we're talking about trying to keep certain distance in a small confined space. So we believe 4 persons would be about appropriate. So that's how we decide on the limit on the size of the gathering. Now you mentioned playgroup. Sorry, I didn't quite catch that. What about the playgroup question? Playgroup, you mean children's playgroup? Sorry, speaker's not coming through. We do not at all encourage such places to continue their operation, especially we're talking about a gathering of a large number of children. Now, I think for exemptions, I don't think they cover this kind of gathering. So for gathering more than 4 children in these places, that's banned. Now, you mentioned that case. First of all, anyone in Hong Kong must observe the laws of Hong Kong. Now, in the laws of Hong Kong, as long as there are specific provisions on what constitutes an offense, and if someone is suspected to have committed the offense, the law enforcement authorities will then enforce the law. And every time when an operation is mounted, it is based on the evidence collected. For any arrest, the police will carry out in-depth investigation and collect evidence, and then they will seek advice from the Department of Justice before they decide on the next step. On the case details, well, the case is now under investigation, so I will not comment on the details of the case, but the Law Enforcement Department in Hong Kong will certainly work in accordance with the law. They will collect the relevant evidence, and they will seek the advice of the Department of Justice to follow up on the case in an appropriate manner. About the female police officer case, Secretary for Security, please. Now, let me first answer the follow-up question. Now, well, if there are clear provisions in the law as to what constitutes an offense, then the Law Enforcement Department may take action in accordance with the provision. And they will also, during investigation, the police will only deal with the evidence. Now, about a report of a female police officer not wearing a mask, of course, that is not appropriate. Thank you very much.